Let's switch gears and talk about tissues now. What are they? Tissues are aggregates or groups of cells that are organized to perform one or more specific common functions. So the organs and organ systems of the body are made up of combinations of different tissues. So as we go through the different blocks in our curriculum, we will study all of the basic tissues in great detail. However, at this time, we're just going to do an overview of the basic tissue types so that you can get some basic vocabulary and you can understand the organization of the tissues and their roles or functions. The four basic tissues are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. Each one of these has a number of subtypes, and as we do these in more detail during the year, we're going to talk about the characteristics of them and learn how to subclassify them. But for now, let's just familiarize ourselves with these four basic tissues. Epithelium are sheets of cells that can be flat or folded into pleats, tubes, or even spheres. The adjacent cells are always very tightly adhered to one another, and they have polarity. In other words, they have a top apical surface or a bottom basal surface. They line and cover body surfaces and organs and even blood vessels, where they provide protection. A good example of that is the epidermis of your skin. That's an epithelia that has a protective function. Or they provide compartmentalization. A good example of that would be the epithelium that lines your gastrointestinal tract, which compartmentalizes the contents, which is being digested, from the underlying tissues. They can regulate transport and absorption of materials, and they can form the glands. In other words, they control secretion and excretion. So the subtypes of epithelium are classified in two ways: by the thickness of the epithelial layer and by the shape of the cells that form the epithelium. And you can have various shapes as are listed here. Here's a couple of real-life examples of simple epithelia that have only one layer thick. So these short cube-like ones are called cuboidal, so that would be simple cuboidal, and the tall ones are called columnar. Some stratified epithelia are shown here. The flattened cells at the surface define this left one as a stratified squamous epithelia, and the cuboidal shaped cells at the apical surface in this tubular structure show this to be a stratified cuboidal epithelium. Now let's look at connective tissue. Connective tissues are formed by cells and matrix that are widely separated from one another. This contrasts with the epithelia that we just looked at, which are always tightly adhered to one another. So the cells here are widely separated, and they are surrounded and embedded in this extracellular macromolecular complex of proteins and fluids, which we're just going to call extracellular matrix, or sometimes just ECM. Connective tissues are highly vascularized. Their cell population is also quite variable. Many cells migrate in and out of connective tissues, as well as cells that reside there all the time. And the subtypes are largely determined by the matrix rather than the cells. Connective tissues are the most diverse of the four basic tissues, and I'm going to show you this little schematic of how to classify them. You don't need to memorize this. I'm just showing you this so that you can see that there are many different subtypes of connective tissues, so you can understand that they will look very different from one another. So what does connective tissue do? Well, it forms skeletal structures like cartilage and bone. It makes attachments and support structures like ligaments, tendons. It provides a conduit for blood vessels and nerves. It fills in spaces and provides cushioning. For instance, filling in space, such as the connective tissue that underlies a lot of epithelial sheets, or cushioning, such as the fat that surrounds many organs and keeps them in place and provides cushioning for them. Also, fat provides storage of metabolites. And very importantly, as you're going to see in the next block, connective tissue is the environment for defensive response. So here's a couple of examples of connective tissues, what we call connective tissue proper. Loose connective tissue of the mesentery, which lines the body cavity, or dense regular connective tissue. This example is showing you a tendon. And the adipose connective tissue, which is fat. So the diversity of their appearance and their function is pretty amazing. Here's a couple of examples of specialized connective tissues. And yes, blood is indeed a connective tissue. So the blood cells that flow throughout your entire body are connective tissue, just like bone is another specialized connective tissue. Looks completely different from blood. The next basic tissue that we're going to look at is muscle tissue. This is a tissue that's specialized for contraction. There are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Many of you will know these from some basic anatomy courses that you may have had if you had anatomy and physiology. So these various types of muscles have their own specific functions and locations, and we will look at them in much greater detail as we go through various blocks, such as cardiovascular and movement mechanics. Here's a couple of examples. On the left you can see skeletal muscle with its very characteristic banded pattern, and smooth muscle, which looks very different from skeletal muscle, but also has characteristic which you can define, and you will learn all the details of when we get to that point. The final basic tissue is nervous tissue. This tissue is specialized for transmission of electrical signals that regulate brain function, muscle activity, and glandular secretion. There are two major cell types in nerve tissue, and those are the neurons, or the nervous tissue cells. These are the cells that generate and receive and pass along electrical signals that carry out these regulatory functions that I just mentioned. And the glia, which is essentially a support cell population. These are quite diverse. Mixed cell population provide metabolic and structural support to the neurons. And just as an aside, in general, the neurons are very big and the glia are very small. So, the nervous system is quite complex, and we won't really delve into it at all right here, but I'll just say that there are two major divisions, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. The central being made of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is everything else. So in the peripheral nervous system, you can see a lot of these axons in a peripheral nerve itself, and you can also see collections of neurons called ganglia, which are these very large cells surrounded by the very small cells of the glia that I mentioned earlier. And here are some examples of nervous tissue in the central nervous system. On the left, you have a cross-section of the spinal cord, and you can see the kind of butterfly-shaped area in the middle, which is the gray matter containing neurons, and the white matter on the outside, which is really just axons projecting out. And then on the right side, we have a higher mag of the cerebellum, which is a portion of the brain, and you can see the large cells that live there, as well as smaller glia surrounding them. So in summary, you should familiarize yourself with the organelles and basic tissues so that when we look at the organ systems as we go through this curriculum, you will be familiar with the functions of all of those tissues and organelles and be able to put things in context.